Hello, everyone. My name is Hallie Ecker, and I am the project director of the Safe and Supportive Schools Technical Assistance Center. I'm here joined today by Lori DiCarlo, Superintendent of Randolph Academy, to discuss Tier 2 restorative practices, responding to conflict and solving problems. So far, we've recorded sessions on Tier 1 restorative practices in schools, and also Tier 3, and even some sessions on virtual circles. But today we're going to hone in on what happens and how to address conflict or harm that occurs in the classroom or school. There's some essential questions to guide our discussion today. The first is, how do Tier 2 restorative practices fit into the tiered framework, that multi-tiered approach to restorative practices? 2, we'll look at what are examples of Tier 2 strategies and or practices. We'll walk you through how they're implemented, including their purpose, who they're implemented with, and kind of a structure for the script for each of those strategies. And then last, we'll talk about the intended outcomes of Tier 2 restorative practices. So what are we hoping to do or accomplish by implementing some of these strategies? With that, Lori, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Hallie. I'm excited about this discussion today, and I think we have 7 great restorative practices at Tier 2 to share. But before we dive into that, let's just step back a minute and remember how this fits into the MTSS framework for restorative practices. We are presuming that people have knowledge of Tier 1 and basic knowledge of circle process. Tier 1, the proactive restorative practices, are what Tier 2 rests upon. So Tier 2 interventions will get a better result if you have a strong Tier 1 practice in your school. And we define Tier 1 in our school as addressing conflict at the classroom level and solving problems at the classroom level. Now, the line between Tier 2 and Tier 3 varies from setting to setting, but we define it as Tier 3 are safety issues, of a more serious nature. So today we're going to hone in on those mid-level issues that are really anchored in conflict and problems. When you look at the continuum of restorative practices by Wachtel and McCord, they have them divided as preventative and responsive. So for today, we're going to look at the first 2 columns on the responsive side of this continuum, using affective statements in relational conversation and then some circles. So another resource from McCold and Wachtel that I think is really relevant to Tier 2 practices is their social discipline window. Traditional discipline usually falls in the quadrant of issuing consequences to kids and tend to be of a more punitive nature. But Hallie, I know you and I both love that the restorative practices are doing school with kids and solving problems with kids. So I think the social discipline window is so valuable.
Yeah, and I think doing these types of strategies with kids is not only an opportunity for them to see it modeled and to see that teachable moment and to really help them hone in on what are some strategies for their own conflict management for things that they might encounter. So I think it's a great opportunity to involve them, have that shared accountability, but also as a modeling strategy or approach.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first one we're going to share is a one-on-one restorative hallway chat. Now, I call it the hallway chat because in my experience, that's where it happens most of the time. But in other print material, you may see it called a restorative conversation. Really, the purpose is to address a classroom problem that involves one student and to do it right away. And it usually involves just the teacher and the student. And the script that I'm presenting here as an example combines the restorative questions, which are the first few lines, with what's known as nonviolent communication process in the light blue. So it would go something like this, I'd like to talk with you in the hall. I'd like to talk with you about what's happening in class. Can you share with me what's happening? What are you thinking and feeling right now? Who's being affected by this? How are they being affected? So all of these things elicit responses from the student. But the second part is where you help the student understand how this is affecting you. So the teacher would say, well, I'd like to share that when I see or hear you being disrespectful to your peers in class, it really makes me feel uneasy and uncomfortable. And I really need to have respect in our classroom between everyone. You know, are you willing to speak in a tone of voice that's polite and use kind words? So this, I just sort of modeled an example of a really, common behavior that happens in classrooms between peers.
And I think too, what I like about this is that you lead with, what is the student thinking and feeling? And I think that's particularly validating to them. But I also appreciate that you've added, this piece at the bottom in the light blue to allow the teacher an opportunity to state how it affects them. And I think that, I like also that not only are we sharing emotions, but we're focusing on behaviors that we can see and observe, right? We're not making assessments or judgments about what students are doing. We're really trying to think about what is that observable behavior and what feelings and emotions does that produce for both of us. And I think that's a more productive conversation sometimes than maybe different approaches that, don't consider those pieces.
When I was a young teacher, it was, my habit to have a much more authoritative hallway chat and give the kid a talking to, so to speak. So learning this approach of using restorative questions and then the nonviolent communication to express my own feelings and what I value in behaviors in the classroom and make a request to, of the student of what I really need as a teacher, is so much more balanced, and it really is doing school with kids. And the next slide, it's a nice graphic that kind of outlines the nonviolent communication process that was developed by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg. And there's so much available on this, but in its most basic form, it starts with what you've observed. Just stick with the facts. What can you see? What do you hear? How does it make you feel? And then what are your needs in terms and stated in terms of a value, and then giving a request to the student. So I encourage people to explore nonviolent communication further because it's a great skill to possess. Now we're going to give some examples of tier 2 practices that really utilize circle process. So these are a little more formal than the hallway chat we just described, and they do require a little bit of planning. First of all, voluntary participation of the people involved and making it clear what is the purpose of the circle. And then thinking about who's been affected, because that's what makes a circle so powerful, is when the person who caused harm is able to hear from others who they've affected and to hear how they've affected them. And then really finding a time and place that's mutually convenient. Always use circle process. It's really important that the person who's facilitating a tier 2 circle has had some training. And, sit in the open circle. This is a powerful thing to create vulnerability and openness to each other. Reviewing the shared agreements sets a good frame for the process. Using the talking piece creates equity of voice, and it keeps things organized so that conversation doesn't get off track. And then use the restorative questions. They have stood the test of time. But when you're dealing with conflict or solving a problem at tier 2, it is so important to have follow-up, and that kind of distinguishes tier 2 from tier 1. Tier 2 does require monitoring and evaluating whether there was positive impact.
And I noticed too, one thing that is really important, I think can't be underscored enough, is we just talked about, that one-on-one restorative chat, which, it can be spur of the moment. It's not something you really plan and prepare for. But if you are going to, utilize the circle process, Although you can, circle up really quickly once you're really well versed and trained, it does, require some planning and preparation on your part in terms of really thinking about really great prompts to spark that discussion that you're looking for. But I also like that this piece here that it's voluntary. So, no circle, no one's required or mandated to participate in a circle. It's meant to be something that everyone has like, that equal voluntary, approach to. And I think that's important to remember and to know that you can always pass when you're in the circle. And it might take some time for students to warm up or even staff to warm up to be able to really participate fully.
Yeah. And people will be so much more comfortable with tier 2 if there's been a strong tier 1 routine in the school.
It's a great
So
point.
the first example we have is an attendance circle. It's really intended, the purpose is to get at the root cause of what's underlying the student's chronic absence, and to co-create a plan. That co-creation is, again, reflects that concept of responding with the student in a collaborative way, and identifying supports that will help improve attendance. So some of the people who may be invited to this are the student and their parents, for sure. If there are any community service providers, it would be logical to have them there. The school counselor, a support person can be chosen by the student, someone that they have a significant relationship with from the school community. And often these are facilitated by the dean of students or the school principal. And here's a script that I offer. We start with introductions and an affirmation round to affirm the student. And this gets things off on a very positive note. And then we use these versions of the restorative questions. What is happening that contributes to absence? And the talking piece is passed around and everyone responds to this prompt. What are you thinking and feeling about school? Once again, everyone responds to this prompt. Who's affected and how? And then the most important part that lays the groundwork for co-creating a plan to improve attendance. What can be done to improve attendance? What supports are needed? And, we have found that this process is a real discovery process, because often what's underlying the absence is something that we couldn't have predicted or guessed. So ending with a written plan that everyone agrees to is really important, and then identifying who will monitor and follow up.
I think too, I think about, the difficulties and challenges we've faced in the last year, more than a year now with COVID, and thinking forward about post-COVID, will we still see those attendance issues, and how might we manage them in a way that engages students, makes them feel more connected to school? Because I think that that's, the fundamental piece of foundational whole school kind of supports of increasing or improving attendance, is that students have to feel connected to school. They have to feel like there are peers or adults at school that they can talk to and that want them to be there. And I think that this is a proactive strategy, but one that will really engage students positively and help them. And I appreciate that there's, an outcome of this. There's a written plan, and it's something that I think will show both parents and school staff that there's and the student that there's an investment in them being at school every day. So I appreciate this strategy.
The next example of a tier 2 circle that we'll share has to do with re-entry following a suspension. When a student's been suspended out of school, it's stigmatizing, and often they come back very ill at ease. And this process helps to re-engage the student positively and make them feel welcomed back, but gives time and attention to the relationships that were possibly harmed, and also some focus on how to prevent repeating the behavior. So who would attend this type of tier 2 re-entry circle? Well, the facilitator, perhaps the principal, definitely the student and their parent or person in parental relationship, school counselor, teachers, and other staff and or potentially students. Script that I would offer for a reentry circle is to open with introductions and then get right to the heart of who was affected by this suspension and how. Pass the talking piece and let everyone in the circle respond to that. What can be done to repair the harm and make things right? There might be some residue with negative residue with the people who were directly impacted by the behavior that triggered the suspension. So this is to identify that and think about what can be done to make things right. And finally, what would you like to see now that the student's back in school? And once again, this reentry circle ends with a written plan that's co-created by those who are involved. And importantly, it includes supports to help make the students' reentry to school a success.
Great, and I love again that this one is really focused when we think about, how can we prevent a behavior from occurring again. This is an opportunity to review expectations. This is an opportunity to review again, harm that has been done, repairing those relationships, and really, suspensions create kind of a fracture in relationships. And I think sometimes when kids come back, we don't always intentionally plan for their return. And I think that this is a very easy way to welcome them back and make them feel connected, or reestablish that connection. And again, like you said before, using these approaches at tier one is community-based, procedures and practices and things that are routines that are, often used in the school. Doing them in this, sort of scenario and context will not, feel as new or novel.
Mm-hmm. True, very true. Our next example is an example of staff circles. And, sometimes the adults in the school community encounter conflict with each other that harms relationships. So, restorative practices at tier two are not only for students, they're for staff as well. So who might facilitate this? Probably a neutral party. In our school, we use members of the RJ team to help. And you would bring together the affected persons. Usually it's two people, and they are invited to bring a support person with them if they wish. The script is just the classic restorative questions. What happened? Pass the talking piece and give everyone a chance to respond. What were you thinking and feeling at the time? Who was affected and how? And finally, what can be done to repair the harm to your relationship and make things right? Usually this type of process ends in a verbal agreement, and it is amazing how when people hear from their coworker about how they were affected, it really does tend to clear the air and make people more open to each other.
Great. And I'm just thinking of an application of this, thinking that, classrooms where there are multiple adults and things are constantly very hectic happening, maybe some conflict or disagreements may arise. I'm thinking, a special ed classroom with a TA or para, or even, a co-teaching situation where you have a gen ed and special educator working together and perhaps conflict arising with, clashing, ways of teaching or managing and things like that. So I think that this is an opportunity both to mediate and address conflict, but also build community with the adults that you're teaching with every day.
I'll admit the first time we pulled staff into a tier two circle like this, it was awkward. And, I think that people had the concept that these circles would only be used with 4 students. But over time, staff reached to the opportunity to have dialogue to solve problems because they're much more comfortable with it now that it's been in place for a number of years and they know that it really helps. Because if you ignore the conflict or the problem, it's only going to get worse. So addressing it in a structured way like this tier 2 staff circle really is a helpful strategy. There's another example of a staff circle that's been used in schools. Some in my school and other schools in our region use this on even a daily basis. I know one special ed program that meets at the end of every day and does this fishbowl technique. And basically in the center, there's a moderator or facilitator, and then a teacher will bring forward a problem that they're encountering with the class or with a particular student. And then there are other participants who are in the inner circle, and then there's this empty chair. In the outer circle are other members of the school community. And there's dialogue asking what's happening, and the process goes like, have you thought about this or have you tried that? And it's really brainstorming to try to help the teacher come up with some possible strategies and ideas. The empty chair is open for people from the outer circle to step in and offer a suggestion and then step out. And then another person from the outer circle has the opportunity to sit into the inner circle and offer input. To get a good idea of this strategy, there's a really wonderful YouTube video that we have identified below. So I invite you to check it out. It's sort of the Tier 2 restorative practices version of a staffing meeting or a child study team. So as I said in the intro, Tier 2 strategies are really meant to solve problems at the classroom level. So the classroom problem solving circle is a classic. And, you know, it's really meant to address a problem that's affecting the whole class. And it's not meant to address a problem that calls out only one student. It's, for example, it might be used to address peer cruelty in a class, or disrespectful comments, or talking out in class, some more universal problems. And it would involve the teacher and the class of students. And they would circle up, and the teacher would open the circle by stating what the problem is, and then ask the students these prompts that would be offered in rounds using the talking piece. What are you thinking and feeling when this problem occurs? Who's affected by this problem and how? And what can be done to solve the problem? In the end, the class comes to a verbal agreement of what they're going to do to solve the problem. And this is really a great example of solving problems with the students. And finally, classroom circles that address significant events in the community or even large-scale events in society are examples of Tier 2 restorative circles. And it really helps to process emotions as a classroom community and to find hope together. So it involves the teacher and the students in the class. And the script is a version of the classic restorative questions. What were you thinking and feeling when you heard about what happened? How does this incident affect us all? What would you like to see the community do to prevent this from happening again? How can we help people heal and become stronger? And then a checkout round, how are you feeling about this circle? Recently, I've been working with a school that's been impacted by the loss of two students who died by suicide. And this process has really helped everyone, express their feelings of sadness and loss, but come together and find hope. And another example, another school I worked with used the same circle script to respond after the January 6th attack on our nation's capital. And it really ended up giving the class and the students really a sense of relief and a lot more hope. And they were a lot more encouraged after they had the opportunity to engage in this Tier 2 circle. So just a recap of what we've covered, Tier 2 restorative practices are used to respond to conflict at the classroom level or even in the school. And these strategies and practices that we included are the attendance circles, staff circles, classroom problem solving circles, and then responding after a significant or large-scale event, and reentry following suspension. All of these practices are built upon the principles of restorative justice, and they're meant to build community, manage conflict, and resolve harm. Just a closing thought, you know, a lot of the problems in the world would be solved if we talk to each other instead of about each other. And circle process will help us do just that.
All right, thank you so much, Lori. I feel like every session we do is jam-packed with strategies, but I think that particularly this one has shown us just how, you know, diversified this approach can be, and how flexible and responsive it can be to many different needs that present themselves in the classroom or school. So I just thank you for being here today, and thank you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us. And you'll see our website on your screen there, www.nys.sssstac.org, and also see my email there for you. If you have any technical assistance needs in the realm of school climate, we're always here to help, whether that's, you know, support for your teams or even just resources on some of the great topics like we've talked about today. So just thank you so much, Lori, as always.
You're welcome.